Hello, I'm Mark McSweeney, Executive Director of the Association Societies Alliance. We are proud to partner with our member SAEs across the country and, of course, Jeff Tannenbaum and Christina Llewellyn to provide today's program, Creative Solutions for Associations 2021 Meeting and Conference Legal Challenges. Today's webinar is being recorded and a link to the recording will be made available after the program concludes. In addition, a PDF of today's slide deck is available in the Handouts tab on your GoToWebinar panel. Before we get started, I do want to quickly take advantage of this opportunity to remind you of our new real-time compensation benchmarking program, a 24/7, 365-day-a-year platform available through your local SAE that provides association executives with compensation and HR-related data, offering key benchmarking information for your important staffing decisions throughout the year. Check with your local Society of Association executives to learn more and start participating today. And with that, let's get to the reason you're here and introduce today's presenters. Jeff Tannenbaum is one of the nation's leading nonprofit attorneys and also is an accomplished author, lecturer, and commentator on nonprofit legal matters. As managing partner of the nationally recognized Washington, D.C.-based Tannenbaum Law Group, Jeff counsels his clients on the broad array of legal issues affecting trade and professional associations, charities, and other nonprofits. For 19 years, Jeff practiced law at the Venable Law Firm and chaired its nonprofit practice for most of that time. Among numerous other honors and awards, Jeff was the 2006 recipient of the American Bar Association's Outstanding Nonprofit Lawyer of the Year Award and is one of only 5 lawyers in the prestigious U.S. Legal 500's Not-for-Profit Hall of Fame. Jeff is author of the ASA published book, Association Tax Compliance Guide, and currently serves as chair of the American Bar Association's Trade and Professional Association Subcommittee and on the ASAE Legal Advisory Council and Public Policy Committee. Christina Llewellyn is a seasoned association executive who has served industries ranging from window manufacturers to court reporters to proposal writers. She brings a data-driven framework to business planning and strategy, having earned her MBA from the Rochester Institute of Technology and the Certified Association Executive designation from the American Society of Association Executives. She was named the Executive Director of the Association of Technology Leaders in Independent Schools in 2019 and serves in a variety of ways as an advocate for independent schools and their leadership teams. Please welcome Jeff and Christina.
Thank you, Mark, and welcome everyone to our program today. We have a great large crowd of you from across the country joining us for our program today. Fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, we only have an hour or the better part of a little bit less than an hour to get through a lot of information. Really pleased to be doing this program with Christina, and hopefully between the two of us, you're going to get some really good, helpful, practical advice and tips to take away with you. I know I've seen many of you, and many of you have seen me over the last 10 months as I've done a lot of speaking on these topics of association meeting conferences and contracts and cancellations. And it's been quite a whirlwind roller coaster, as all of you well know, over the last 10 months. And it very much continues. But at the same time, the landscape, the legal, the business, the economic landscape that we're dealing with when it comes to association meetings and conferences is very much changing. It's very fluid. My colleague and I have worked with hundreds and hundreds of associations, with even well more than that, probably 600, 700, 800 different conferences that we've been working on and advising on over the last 10 months. So I can tell you from a lot of very, very practical experience that the landscape is changing and it's getting more difficult for associations, and it's only going to get more difficult in the coming months. Over the first 10 months of the pandemic in 2020, we had a really high success rate of being able to execute force majeure, kind of penalty-free terminations on behalf of our association clients in the vast majority of the cases, some involving some rebooking of conferences. Many did, but many without, and having great success with that. That is no longer the case in most situations, and it does not look to be the case for many meetings, particularly once we get past the first quarter of 2021. Of course, no one has a crystal ball. We don't know what things are going to look like when it comes to the pandemic. But I can tell you already from the way that hotels and convention centers are responding to associations' requests, demands for cancellation, for rebooking, for postponement and whatnot, that the hotels and convention centers, which are reeling financially, have really started to dig their heels in much more than we saw before. And what it's going to take, and has been taking, is new strategies for trying to effectively deal with this and mitigate the downside risk for associations. And that's going to be the focus of today's program. So Christina is here today to give kind of one illustrative case study of a unique kind of hybrid, what she calls hedging model that she came up with and executed on behalf of her association very successfully. This is not the one size fits all solution for everyone, but I think it has some important illustrative elements that all of us can learn from when it comes to trying to come up with new, creative, different strategies for dealing with these challenges in the coming months. And I will help kind of extrapolate some lessons and tips for all of you once Christina finishes her kind of case study. And then, as for many of you who know me and my approach to these things, I want to leave as much time as possible for questions. I know we have 500 plus people on this webinar, so we're not going to be able to get to all of your questions, but I encourage you to pose your questions in the chat feature of the web, the GoToWebinar software, and Mark McSweeney is going to be posing those questions to us at the appropriate times. Feel free to ask questions now. I told Mark to interject. If we get timely questions now, we're happy to deal with them. But I think most of the questions we'll deal with after Christina finishes her remarks and I give some follow-up. So without any further ado, Christina, why don't you take it from here?
Great. Thank you guys so much for having me. And I know that you're going to see my slides. I like many of you, my association has been on a roller coaster. And in the last year, almost year, I was actually at Great Ideas in ASAE's Great Ideas in Salt Lake when my world was blowing up because I had a conference the first week of April. So sitting there in the first week of March and having the world go into lockdown was pretty stressful. And as it turns out, that was a wonderful benefit to the association because we were in that very early wave of force majeure. And we were able to walk away from our Chicago event with relatively unscathed. And we also had the benefit of the pre-Zoom fatigue world. And so we had a very successful transition to a virtual solution. But what I knew in fairly short order, especially as we made our way through the summer and into the fall months, is that this was not going to go away. There was not going to be an easy solution. And so even though I dodged a bullet early in the pandemic, I knew that my small association was likely to face another bullet. And so I was looking at a contract that I had inherited when I came in as executive director about 18 months ago to have an event in Seattle in April of 2021. And we can kind of go, I posted these slides in the handout section. You can follow along if you'd like. But ultimately, and I have a different driver, so I will thank Mark to kind of follow along here. But I knew, if you head into the first slide, that we were going to need to get to phase 4 in the city of Seattle in order to have an event. Our event would have been about 500 people or so. And so I knew that kind of where we needed to get to based on these government standards at the time was to get into this phase 4 thing. I had been talking to the hotel. I knew that there was another group in our hotel, but they were already making moves. I think they were healthcare providers. And they were already making moves to get out of that contract and kind of punt it farther along. So where I started this kind of strategy, or where I started to unravel this or put together the puzzle, maybe is a better way to look at it, is I knew I needed COVID appropriate space diagrams. So before I could even talk about whether to be there or whether not to be there, I really challenged the property to give me what they considered kind of COVID safe diagrams. If I was going to normally have a 500 person event and I booked that kind of space, how much could they actually accommodate? And the hotel did get back to me, and give me, single table, one person per 6-foot table with space in between, and it looked like I could accommodate about 200 people. So that gave me a starting point for my information. I will also disclose that I did attend personally, and some of you have seen my blogs about this on LinkedIn. I went to the Connect event in Florida, and I wanted to know how it felt. I wanted to kind of take my own inventory of when I personally felt safe, when I felt exposed, what I felt went well, what I thought was a challenge. And so I was sort of in this data collecting mode through the fall. We can go through these next couple slides fairly quickly, because really my main point was if we needed to get to a level where there were only 25 cases per 100,000, if you advance to the next slide, you'll see that on September 8th, I'm watching it, okay, it's 77 per 100,000. And then if you go to the next slide, by September 23rd, I was like, oh, maybe we're heading in the right direction. It's down to 55 per 100,000. But if you go a couple more slides, you'll see that by the time we got to November 3rd, and then by the time we got to November 23rd, those numbers were spiking. So at this point, I need to figure out what I'm going to do. Now, as we move into the next slide, let me share with you that these are not actually numbers from my organization. I just kind of did some rounding to make it easy and for the purposes of this case study. Granted, this is a much smaller situation, and even my organization deals with a much smaller in-person event than many of yours. But I think that what is useful here, and what I've heard from some other association executives who run much larger events, is that this can be applied even in a larger kind of situation. I will also briefly address the fact that I have this unique situation where I'm not dealing with a large trade show. I have exhibits. They're primarily, kind of glorified tabletops. So we have sponsors. We're a big sponsor kind of organization. We have tabletops, but not to where I have like a trade show floor. So I will openly admit that this is not, a silver bullet solution for if you've got a huge trade show. But this is more professional development focused, content focused with the sponsorship presence at our event. So knowing that I basically went and got the hotel to talk to me about what they could accommodate in the space that was in my contract, if you hit me to the next slide, you'll see that I needed to first go back and get them to revise down. And so we worked on an addendum. I said, well, if you can't accommodate 1,000 people or 500 people, let's see what, obviously the room block has to, and the F&B has to match a lower head count. And that seemed reasonable to them. So part of where this strategy works is that I first went back and I revised with an addendum to my contract downward my room block obligation and my F&B obligation. So again, these are not my actual numbers, but I can tell you that overall it came to about a 40% reduction on both fronts. So with a lower room block and a lower F&B, I had a couple choices. So certainly what I was hearing at that time is that my hotel was considering that if you move to a future date, they would take 50% of the fee that you owed them and apply it to a future date. But again, I don't want them sitting on 150 grand of my association's money for 5 years. So to me, that was not really an ideal solution. I feel like I also watched many associations punt or kick the can, and only to have to pick up that very sharp and spiky can a few months later or a year later, and it wasn't necessarily the ideal solution they thought it was. So having witnessed a lot of that, I just don't want to kick the can. I wanted to solve the issue immediately. So if you hit to my next slide, what that led me to was I kind of went back to some of my training from my business degree, and I went with what I have affectionately, yes, Jeff, called the hedge strategy. I'm going to walk you through pretty quickly what I had to think about with my association, and then I'm going to get to the final page with the math in terms of why this works. So the first thing I did, if you go to the next slide, is I know a bunch of organizations in my space are doing virtual events, and pricing for those virtual events is problematic. So one of the issues was, where do I fall in terms of other both regional organizations and other national organizations kind of sharing the independent school space. The proposed Atlas pricing that you see there in the orange, again, for the purposes of this illustration, it's a little different, but ultimately it's a pretty high ticket item, and our members are kind of used to paying that. I know a lot of organizations went with a lower price for their virtual offering, but if you go to the next slide, part of what I had to deal with in terms of projecting my registration is that last year when we canceled the Chicago event, again, we were only 30 days out. And so we had already collected all of our revenue for registration. Instead of getting into this massive thing of refunding money, and of course, I didn't know what this crisis was going to bring us, I wanted to hold on to the funds as much as I could. I knew that I owed what we did was we offered half price for next year in Seattle. So we were going to go virtual. We were not offering a refund, but if you had paid for your registration, we were going to offer you a half price credit. So part of what I had to do in looking at this strategy was take into consideration what I owed. And this may not apply to you because this is kind of a unique situation, but I think if you're looking at something like this for your organization, there may be accommodations that you put into place early in the pandemic that will now come home to kind of show their heads, and you're going to have to deal with that. The next thing that I had to deal with, if you go to slide 2, is that there's also been this weird shift in the independent school space where back in, before the pandemic, we were selling tickets per person. Now, a lot of the organizations are selling registrations per school. So how do I then estimate how many new schools will come into my world, right? So that was another consideration. Again, may not apply to you, but it certainly applied to me. And finally, if you go to step 3, this is where we get into the hedge strategy. So if you advance me one more slide, here's what I figured. My hedge strategy was, what if we have an event in a virtual event in the beginning of April, and basically run the full gamut of our content, our traditional 2.5 days. We'll do it in a couple days, awards, banquets during lunch, and keynote speakers or whatever, our traditional approach. We will run a virtual conference in the beginning of April. Then at the end of April, when we are contracted to be in Seattle at this property, and they can only accommodate a couple hundred people, let's do an add-on retreat for those who have been vaccinated, for those who feel comfortable traveling, for those who can escape their schools and try to regroup with colleagues. So the kind of unique piece of this was that we are, I guess you could call it hybrid, but part of why I'm calling it my hedge strategy is because rather than basically we're making the money on the virtual component because we're charging $1,000 to have this 2-day conference with the traditional content that we promise to deliver. And then the idea is that if you attend that virtual piece, you are then eligible to add on this in-person retreat. If we do that, it would be like a deeper dive into the content that we presented in the beginning of April. You come to the virtual, you kind of do your keynotes and your 1-hour breakouts. The idea would be that when we gather in person in Seattle, those who feel comfortable doing so, we'll do a deeper dive into the content. We'll have facilitators, and we'll make sure that we're kind of getting into the application of what the virtual conference presented. So if you advance me a couple slides, certainly it was not easy math is my point. I had to take into consideration promises I made last year. I had to make guesses on quote regular registration, which how in the world do I benchmark that when we've never done whole school or whole company registration? And now, by the way, I'm doing this little retreat add-on where I'm making the money in the virtual piece and then doing the retreat add-on if we're able to end up having it. So let's go to the final slide where for the purposes of this kind of case study, I've got my pretend math up here. Here's why this works. As you can see in the first column, if I do virtual only, and there's some placeholder numbers in there, there's the virtual registration, the in-person registration I broke out separately. We normally would do some pre-conference workshops and we just hit pause on all of that. If I don't end up having to do the in-person and it's just a virtual event, then certainly I don't have costs. I don't have the AV costs. I don't have on-site Wi-Fi at the negotiated rate. I don't have F&B. I don't have to pay for rooms for my board members. So there are some fees that stay, whether or not it's virtual or in person, as we all know. And we do have, I know I get asked a lot, what's your software solution? We do have a software solution that we use. It's basically our app combined with Zoom in kind of a creative way. So I didn't have to make a huge investment in a Cadillac solution for a virtual conference because our conference is pretty traditional. Then you'll see, so at the end of the day, if I have virtual only, my net profit, I guess, my surplus would be around $450,000 in this example. If I end up having to do the retreat, let's say by some miracle, Seattle actually makes it to phase 2 and they are able to host an event over 25 people and they can have my approximately 150 or 200 people. If I end up having the retreat, I add another 35 grand in revenue. I do have some expenses, of course, because I have to pay for AV and F&B, but then at the end of the day, I still make $269,000. Now, compare that with if I canceled today, the hotel would say, give me my fee, and I might, if I'm feeling generous, let you apply half of that fee to a future conference that you may or may not want to have in Seattle. As opposed to this strategy, it really takes away that game of chicken. Because at this point, I am collecting $99 per head to host this in-person retreat. And if the hotel is able to accommodate me, I am fully prepared. My staff and I will have the in-person event at the end of April in 2021. However, if Seattle doesn't get there and 30 days before the event says, I'm sorry, we can't accommodate you because we're still in phase 3 and we need to be in phase 2 according to our local requirements, then all I have to do at that point is refund $99 per person. And actually, if the retreat ends up getting canceled, as you can see in this hedge, I make more money for my organization. We have plans. My board is super supportive of this approach. And we have plans that if we end up not having the retreat, we would take that surplus and invest it in some new programming that aligns with our strategic plan. So if we end up with this windfall from not having the retreat, we have plans about what we would do with that money and in terms of feeding it back into our hard hit industry. But this approach basically just, again, kind of takes away that game of chicken, and it allows us to proceed with planning rather than waiting and holding our breath of what will happen. I know darn well, and I know Jeff is going to talk about this, it has become virtually impossible to have force majeure take effect at this point. I can't really count on that. And if I do end up getting out of my contractual obligations, it will be very last minute. But I didn't want to cancel and have this, fee, this penalty hanging over my head. So this hedge strategy really worked great for Atlas in that, and we proceeded. It required some additional communication, no doubt, because this is really unique. It's very different, and we had to be quick to get ahead of it in a positive way. So if you want to go to theatlas.org, which is my organization's website, you'll see that the communication around registration was tricky because we had to help them understand that you're doing the virtual conference, that's where the core content would be, and then the retreat we keep referring to as an add-on, because naturally we can't really afford to just have people just do the retreat. Plus, that's not the intention of it. The intention is that it's a deeper dive into things that we had already talked about in the virtual conference. So it for sure has required some extra communication and some creative marketing. But so far, I will say we opened up this strategy. We launched registration quietly in December, and then we started pushing it right after the holiday, leading into the springtime event. And so far, registrations are going fantastic. And so the virtual event is kind of a quote unquote easy sell, especially for those who attended the Chicago event last year and are entitled to that half price registration. They feel like they're getting a deal because not only do they pay half price, they're also allowed to bring their whole school. And so there's a lot of really positive energy around that for our industry. But then the retreat add-on, I am actually surprised how many people jumped in with both feet and said, heck yeah, I'm coming. And obviously, we also had to make sure in our communication, I mentioned that I went to the Connect event, I had to be very proactive about our intentions and our commitment to keeping our members safe. So if we're going to gather in person, then we need to make sure that we're making accommodations that make people feel very comfortable. So we've gone ahead and included that as well. The last thing that I'll mention before I kind of open up to questions and turn it back over to Jeff is regarding sponsorship. Look, let me drop the bomb of a somewhat, maybe this is an unpopular opinion, but here's how I feel about virtual exhibits. I equate them to putting lipstick on a pig. I hate them. My vendors hate them. I've gone to a bunch of conferences. Look, I understand that they're necessary right now, and there's not a lot of great solutions, especially for people who do have a heavy revenue reliance on exhibits and tabletops, etc. I wanted to circumvent that conversation. I just don't think that my audience, I know my sponsors and my vendor partners well enough, they're exhausted by all of these virtual booths. They don't see a high amount of return or engagement from the audience. So I challenge my staff to also, if you think that the hedge strategy is kind of creative and out there, we also stepped way outside the box when it came to sponsorships. Some of you followed some of that journey with me on Collaborate. But basically, I said, if we end up doing the Seattle retreat, once again, I almost treated the tabletops in Seattle like an add-on. Like, if our sponsors want one, we'll give it to them for practically nothing. I'm also not going to collect any revenue on those tabletops until I can guarantee that we will be in person. I just don't want a bunch of money being shuffled back and forth. So we will charge them for their annual commitment with us, whatever they choose to do, but we will leave off the tabletop thing until later. So we looked at really creative ways, which included reinvigorating an industry publication that had kind of gone to the wayside. And we are definitely going to go down the path of like an in-person swag box to go with the virtual component of our event. So some ideas are maybe a little more creative than others. Certainly, they're more creative for our space. And the main point was that we just wanted to avoid this conversation about a virtual booth. So if you're going to come at me with questions about that, I'm not your girl. I definitely don't have solutions for you in terms of virtual exhibit halls. But I do have a sponsorship, kind of need in my space. And now that I had kind of solved this hotel situation, I then went with my team and we really looked at how to solve the sponsorship situation. And I think that demonstrating to the sponsors that we were willing to step toward them with solutions as an association has really gone a long way in terms of those conversations, which of course are unfolding right now. So that is the strategy. Jeff, do you think I missed anything, or is there anything I can clarify for you?
That was perfect. I do have some, why don't I kind of pulled out maybe a half dozen kind of takeaways, and not surprisingly, a bit from a legal perspective, but things that I just want to kind of highlight for everyone that I think are important takeaways from Christina's strategy, which I thought was brilliant. And that was the reason that I asked her to do this program with me, because I was very impressed with this whole approach. It's creative, it's different. And that's the kind, as I said at the top of this webinar, that's the kind of approach that I think associations are going to need to come up with in order to get through these difficult coming months. A few things, and then we'll take some questions. Well, we'll take a lot of questions. First off, and this is a strategy that we've utilized and seen our association clients utilize in a lot of situations. Right now, some states, as you know, have significant restrictions on gatherings, like Washington State, DC, and many others. Some states do not. Florida, for instance, we're having the most difficulty with conference and meeting cancellations in Florida because there are literally no restrictions on the number of people who can gather. But even in Florida, there are restrictions on occupancy. You can only have 50% of your usual occupancy in a building and things like that, as well as social distancing requirements. And so even there, but especially, where you have limits on gatherings, the limitations on the number of people that you can gather has been the number one way that associations have been able to utilize force majeure to get out of their contractual obligations with meetings and conferences. But as those restrictions start to loosen and the number of people start to go up, we're not going to see it in a lot of states for the next month or two, but we will likely see it after that, especially as we get most likely into the second quarter of this year and the vaccines start to get more widely administered. We are going to see some of that. Or if you're in a state like Florida where you don't have those limitations, but you still have occupancy limitations and social distancing requirements, using those things like Christina did, to sometimes try to get out of your contracts altogether, to basically say to the property, look, you don't have, if it's a smaller property, you don't have the space to accommodate us. We contracted for a 400 person meeting. You literally cannot, fit 400 people in there. We've been able to use that as leverage to say, look, you are in anticipatory breach of contract because you cannot fulfill your contractual obligations. And so we've used that as leverage sometimes to get out of a contract. Essentially a force majeure type argument, but a little bit different from a legal technical perspective in terms of anticipatory breach. Or you can use it like Christina did as leverage to try to get a reduction in your minimum guarantees for sleeping room revenue and food and beverage revenue. And I thought that was a brilliant strategy, and the corresponding attrition penalties. Because as Christina and I talked about when we first talked about this, I asked her about that. I was very curious. I didn't see how she could have done this without significantly reducing those mandatory minimums and the corresponding attrition penalties for sleeping rooms and food and beverage. And that's exactly what she did, as you saw. And that is absolutely critical. And I'll say that's going to be it's a critical thing that associations are going to have to do, period, as they move forward with the idea of in-person meetings later this year. Whether it's a hybrid or whether it's just a smaller in-person meeting, there's no question in pretty much everyone's mind that I've talked to that in-person meetings for associations for the rest of this year, perhaps even going into next year, but certainly for this year, are going to have less attendees than they did in the past. This is no question about it. So you might have contracted for this a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, whatever minimums you contracted for and the corresponding attrition penalties, you're not going to meet those. And so if you want to have an in-person meeting, you have to reduce those. Now, the good news is we've seen a great willingness on the part of hotels and convention centers so far to be willing to reduce those. Although in many cases, I'd say the majority of cases, not nearly as much as we would like them to reduce them. We're able to get like sometimes 15% reductions, maybe 20%, but really not like the 50% reductions that a lot of our clients really need. But still, that's going to be critically important. Otherwise, you're going to get hit with huge attrition penalties when you don't get the numbers at your in-person meeting, and then it's going to cause significant economic strain on the organization. Another issue, and it really doesn't apply to Christina's example so much, but I've heard this from a lot of our association clients that we hear a lot of talk about hybrid meetings in 2021 because a lot of people are not going to be willing to attend, but you still want to get them engaged, participating, get the revenues from virtual meetings. I've heard from a number of associations, and I am not an expert on the economics here, that holding a hybrid meeting is very difficult in some cases to make profitable. Christina, you probably know more about that than I would, but I've just heard that enough times to recognize that that's just not always going to be the best solution. Another thing to keep in mind is that Christina's solution makes sense in certain cases, particularly in a situation where a straight-on force majeure termination is not possible, or at least not possible yet. As many of you have heard me say many times, the number one key factor in successful force majeure terminations is timing. How close are you to the dates of your meeting? And some associations just can't wait. I was talking to one client yesterday, their meeting is in August of this year. They said they cannot wait any longer. And I said, without any question, force majeure is off the table. You can't do a force majeure termination this far out. No one has a crystal ball to say that those restrictions that are in place now in that state or city or county are going to be in place in August. And so if you want to get out of a contract for August, the only real way to do it is to negotiate a way out, either do a rebook or negotiate the actual cancellation penalties down to some lesser amount. And we have had a few clients that said, we don't want to do a rebook for a variety of reasons. We can't, we don't want to, and we have the assets, we're willing to pay. And I've negotiated a number of these myself and generally gotten at least a 50% reduction. I've never gotten less than a 50% reduction in cancellation fees. And in some cases, even more than that, significantly more than that. But Christina's solution really only makes sense if force majeure is not an option because you can't wait, or for whatever other reasons, you're in Florida or something like that. or a full-on rebook of the conference is not a viable option. You know, you don't have an open date for your annual meeting until, 2030 or, whatever the case may be, or you just don't want to go back to that property, so you don't want to do a rebook. If you are going to do any kind of a rebook or an approach like Christina did, in general, try to avoid having to pay any significant new deposits. You made a reference to that, Christina, that you didn't want to give, you're considering other options. You didn't want to give them a bunch of deposit money. Most of our clients feel the same way. Although I will say we had one last week where we used the promise of a significant additional deposit, basically prepaying 50% of the food and beverage of all of the costs that the association would pay. Not that the members, the attendees would pay, but that association would pay, paying 50% of it now for a meeting that's a rebook that's a few years from now. That was the grease that enabled to get it over the finish line without having to pay any significant cancellation penalty. Sometimes, you're weighing all the options, the pros and cons of different options. You might not want to pay a lot of deposit money, but if you're pretty sure you're going back there anyway, I think in that case it was 2024. Hopefully COVID's far in the rearview mirror by then. And to have the money, it's not a bad thing. I'd rather see them pay 50% as a deposit than pay 50% as cancellation penalties. You also, Christina, referenced your love for virtual exhibits. I know you're such a big fan. Kidding, of course. Another reason why you might not want to be a big fan, and you might have followed some comments I made in some of the association trade press about this, is that there's some real uncertainty as to the taxability of exhibit registration fees from virtual exhibits. It's very unclear. It's incredibly unclear, but there's a real chance that the IRS in an examination and an audit might treat those revenues as taxable unrelated business income, the same as advertising income. It's just another reason that if you were able to convert your virtual exhibits to sponsorships, which some associations have been able to do, sponsorship income, if you follow the qualified corporate sponsorship rules, is almost always going to be tax-free income. And so it's another reason to consider that option. And then finally, Christina also made a reference to this. If you are going to hold any kind of in-person event, whether it's a smaller retreat like Christina's planning, or whether it's a smaller in-person meeting, it's going to be absolutely critical, clearly for the balance of this year, if not beyond, to follow all of the necessary health and safety protocols to protect your members, your employees, and whatnot. I sent a link to Mark to share with you to a place on our firm's website where we have all of our articles and presentations. And one of the articles I wrote a few months ago, or a couple months ago, is all about kind of the top 10 issues facing association meetings, legal issues facing association meetings. That article goes into some great depth about the tips and steps that you can take to help protect your association from liability and whatnot in the event you do hold in-person meetings. You need to follow all of the applicable guidance, particularly from the CDC. The CDC has some very good detailed guidance on its website about holding large meetings and what you can do in the COVID era to keep your attendees safe. You want to try to allocate as much risk and an obligation to the property, the hotel or convention center, as possible, obligate them to do certain things, utilize liability waivers for your attendees. And anyway, we don't have a lot of time to get into the details of that here, but I did want to point that out, that holding an in-person meeting, even once we get a higher penetration level with vaccines, is still going to be very critical for quite some time. So those are the kind of the biggest things that I took away from your presentation, Christina, from a legal perspective. But why don't we open it up now and see what kind of questions we have. And Mark, are you going to field those for us?
I am happy to do so, and we do have quite a few questions. So, Christina, going back to your presentation, can you touch on how your staff at Atlas felt about traveling for the retreat? Did you make that optional or mandatory for them?
So I 100% made it optional. I was not going to force anyone. And I still, to this moment, have some staff that are considering their options on that. So I said, that's a decision you need to make yourself with your family. Please consult a doctor. If you have any out-of-pocket fees, Atlas will cover them. So I wanted to be just really open about making sure that our team felt comfortable making that decision, which they don't have to make yet anyway. But that is a really important aspect, and I'm not forcing anyone to go. I will hire local help if I need to. I will do it myself if I need to. I knew I am comfortable going, and I am blessed. I don't face significant personal risk. I will just need to quarantine for my family after. So, but I'm willing to do that. So I knew at least one person would be there, and I can get local help if I need to.
And from
Great.
a legal perspective, it's very important, and it's going to be for some time, that with respect to your staff, that you make attendance at meetings, like in-person meetings like this, voluntary. And also the same thing applies. There's also an article you'll find on our site about kind of reopening the workplace in the COVID era and the kind of things that associations need to do to protect themselves from liability risk. And that same advice goes there. That for the foreseeable future, for a variety of reasons that you guys are pretty much well aware of, and a variety of legal reasons as well, especially when it comes to employees, you need to make kind of that in-person participation where there is a virtual alternative. Or, in the case of your conference, you have other alternatives. You can hire local folks and whatnot to fill in those shoes. You absolutely need to make participation voluntary.
Fantastic. Thank you. Jeff, you may have answered, I know you addressed this, but I'm going to ask it again just to make sure that the question's been answered for the person asking it. When playing the waiting game to determine if an event is feasible within the various local and state phases, at what time period can you request force majeure?
So my clients are sick of me saying this, but in our experience, and we have quite a bit of it, seeing what works and what doesn't, you need to wait until no sooner than 90 days out from the first start date of your meeting to pull the trigger on a force majeure termination. Meaning, once you get to the 90-day mark, if there are restrictions in place that would prohibit you from holding the meeting on that day, and your meeting starts 90 days later, we've seen a very high success rate of force majeure terminations, and the hotels and the hotel lawyers and convention center lawyers accepting that force majeure termination. Ideally, in a perfect world, and we have had some of our clients be able to wait until the 60-day mark, then your chances of success are going to go up even higher. Most associations can't wait until 60 days. Many can't even wait until 90 days because of pressure from their members and others to cancel the in-person component. But that 90-day mark seems to be kind of a magic number. You can get everything ready to go. And another thing, I deal with this almost every day, you cannot tell your members, your likely attendees, everyone else, that you are planning to have a virtual only event until after you do either the force majeure cancellation. As soon as that letter goes off, and by the way, the content of that letter is really, really important. You want to work with your attorney on that for sure, because you want to throw the kitchen sink and make as strong, credible arguments as to why force majeure applies. But the moment they receive that letter, you can make the announcement. Or if you're going to go the rebook approach, which more and more associations are doing, you need to wait until that rebook, whether it's an addendum or whatever form it's taking, it usually does take the form of some addendum, until that is signed by both parties. You need to wait to announce until that's kind of executed by both parties.
If I could just add, Jeff, that when part of me taking away the chicken in this situation, I don't care when they cancel on me. I'm waiting for them to make a call, right? Because now I can just refund the retreat money 30 days out. What I made sure of was that there would be no implications for my attendees for booking their hotel room. And we just made sure that was clear. So there's as long as they cancel 72 hours out, they won't get a fee. And then we also just encouraged our attendees to take careful consideration in booking flights. Like lots of airlines are offering flexible booking options. So we leave that to the attendee, but we're very clear, like this is still on shaky ground. So we're making sure that people are taking steps to cover their investment.
Yeah.
Thank you. Christina, per your website, you require attendees to stay at the hotel at their own cost. How will you monitor and control this?
In a lot of ways, I don't need to. And I'm very lucky because my members are the CIOs at independent schools, and they understand the pod mentality. You can't cross the pods, right? Because that would create additional risk for students, teachers. And so they keep the students and the faculty together, kind of thing. So I don't feel that we're going to need, we've had a couple questions about it, and we are sticking to our policy of please stay at the hotels, but we're being clear and transparent and saying, you know, not only is it safer for Atlas, it's safer for the hotel staff, it's safer for other attendees to just make a pod and stay there. But we're also just coming clean and explaining that this is, you know, because of the contractual obligations. It also helps Atlas meet its obligations and better serve the membership. So we focus primarily on health and safety because that is the primary reason for it, but naturally we need people in the block.
And to add on to that, one of the things that you'll find on the article section of our website is an article about liability waivers for association meeting attendees. And one of the things that I put into the model liability waiver that we wrote that you'll find there, in addition to the release and waiver itself, you know, releasing the association from any liability if the attendee contracts COVID at or in connection with the event. Kind of the second part of it is kind of an obligation for the attendees to abide by certain conduct requirements and prohibitions. You know, mask wearing, social distancing, proper hand washing, all of those sorts of things, not, you know, coming to the meeting if you're not feeling well or if you have a high temperature or things like that, but also mandating that the attendee is attesting, affirming that they will not, you know, go off site to other places like crowded bars and restaurants and things like that in states or cities where they are open. And that they will, you know, they'll keep themselves safe while they're there. That's really important. I mean, there's obviously only so much policing you can do, but, you know, what we found is that if someone is actually going to, you know, click and accept that they agree to these conduct, you know, requirements and prohibitions, they're more likely to agree to them.
Great.
They're more likely to follow them, I mean.
Christina, how did you mitigate the speaker costs with having full virtual and a new in-person add-on?
Speakers are being flexible. We're lucky, but we're basically kind of going at it and saying, look, you know, we for sure need you to do the keynote for the virtual version, but if you're game, you know, we could have a version of the contract that we have with you that if you wanted to attend in person, if you want to facilitate the retreat with us, we would love to have you consider that and what would the pricing be. And so we have had really open conversations. And frankly, I think the speakers are like intrigued by it. And also like in person, you're going to be in person. So far we've had amazing, in fact, we just, our two biggest like wish list speakers confirmed this morning. So we don't have contracts yet, but in theory, they're game and they're gonna for sure deliver the virtual piece that we need no matter what. And if Seattle happens, they'll hopefully be there.
All right. Jeff, what suggestions or approach can you suggest for a 500 plus person event that is supposed to occur this September in California, which is in a full lockdown? But the venue is unable to talk about canceling until about 60 days before.
Okay, a couple things. And I'm dealing with a number just like this, August, September timeframe in states that are in, you know, pretty severe lockdowns like California. First off, if the venue is saying they can't talk about cancellation until 60 days out, pardon my language, but that's bullshit. They can talk about it sooner. That may be what they want to do. They may want to wait. I've seen from a number of the hotel lawyers, I mean, we've even seen proposed addenda to contracts where they're putting in kind of a new force majeure clause that essentially lets you out, you know, if it's COVID related, but only when you get to the 60-day mark. And the problem is, as I said earlier, that's just too long for most associations to wait. And so, you know, of course, it all depends how much leverage you have. Every association is different. You know, the larger the meeting, the more leverage you have. Are you a long-time customer? How profitable is a meeting? What are your room rates? I mean, you know, what's your food and beverage spend? All those things factor into your leverage. And you might be able to sweeten the pot, like I said earlier, with different things. You know, if you're trying to get a rebook or something. But for them to say they won't even, I mean, they can take the position they won't accept a force majeure termination until 60 days out, which means if you do one 90 days out, it's going to carry more risk. You know, we'd have, if I was advising that association, I would say we're going to have to wait until we get closer. It's just way too soon for force majeure termination. Let's wait until we're, you know, 100 days out. Assess it, assuming you haven't done something else to it with the meeting by then. Let's assess the situation, look at the state of the lockdowns. Let's look at, throughout at the state level and at the city and local level in California, how are things changing or not? And then we can assess like for instance, if it's in the exact same situation it is right now with this complete lockdown, God forbid, I hope we're not in that situation. But if we are, and you're 90 days out, I would probably advise to go ahead with a force majeure termination. I think it would have a high degree of success. But if you can't wait that long and you really need some certainty, you got to try to negotiate a rebook. That's what most associations are doing that want the certainty for that far out. Either negotiate a rebook of the meeting, sometimes throwing in another small meeting, a board meeting next year. There's other things you can do to help sweeten the pot. Sometimes increasing your food and beverage spend, sometimes giving an additional advance deposit because they really need cash right now, the hotels. There's a lot of different things you can do to sweeten the pot. Or if you have the money and you don't want to do a rebook and you're willing to pay some cancellation penalties, try to negotiate, a much lower cancellation penalty amount, 25%, 50%, whatever the amount is. And maybe to help, you can sweeten the pot there by throwing in a smaller meeting or other things. So you got to think creatively. There's no one size fits all solution, but force majeure is just way too premature for that situation.
And I would add that, part of where I think this hybrid solution, kind of helped us, let me just say that everyone is in this boat. And what I see from, I have like lots of CEO groups that I connect with, and we keep each other kind of grounded. Being apoplectic is not going to help. And we're all in this. It's unfair and it sucks. And so the sooner you accept that and calmly start working toward a solution, the better. I find that the CEOs and the meeting planners, CFOs, the ones that basically make the decision, who are like, how dare they not let me cancel 9 months out? That gets you nowhere. And so I have that Italian nature in me too. But I think where I got to fairly quickly was like, okay, we are smart. We can figure this out. This is the reality we're facing. So we have to give and take and figure out a way through it. This worked for me. I'm not going to pretend it's going to work for everybody. I definitely assert that. But I think part of it is also like you have to find a centering and stop being mad about it. Like this is what it is. And I think there's still to this day, there are so many planners and association executives who are just mad. And that really doesn't get you anywhere. This is not an emotional thing. It is a business decision.
It's a great point. I deal with it literally every day with CEOs, CFOs, meeting planners, boards, executive committees. I've seen it all over the map. And, that's sometimes my job as the attorney to come in and kind of ground the client and say, look, these are your options. You may not love the options, but here's your options. Here's the pros and cons of your different options. And you got to make a business decision about what's the best approach and what you can negotiate with the venue.
So it's about 3 minutes to the top of the hour. So we may have time for one more question here. Does impossibility of performance apply to both parties? So in other words, if it's not possible for attendees to attend because of employer restrictions, employer travel restrictions, attendee location, post-travel quarantine requirements, things like that, does the possibility of performance apply to both parties?
So what you're referring to, what the question is referring to is the force majeure language of your contract, the force majeure provision, which generally says, some act of God or other unforeseen event beyond the control of the parties makes it, and then most of these clauses say impossible or illegal for either party to perform under the contract. Some of these clauses will also say inadvisable or commercially impractical, but I'd say 85% or more of them don't. They just say impossible or illegal. And yes, the way those are written, they generally almost always apply to both parties. So if it's impossible or illegal for either party to perform their obligations under the contract, they can get out without penalty. That's what the force majeure clause is all about. So while it technically applies to both, I've yet to see a hotel invoke force majeure because they don't want to. They want you to either hold the meetings or be held liable for the cancellation penalty. So there would be no reason for the hotel, at least I've not seen one yet, to try to get out based on force majeure. We have seen, like yesterday, it was announced that a big convention hotel in DC, the Marriott Wardman Park, is closing, filed for bankruptcy. In a situation like that, force majeure almost becomes a moot point at that point because they breach their obligations under the contract. But in most situations, the hotels have no desire to invoke force majeure.
This may be a real quick question here. Given the comments about meetings likely having less attendees this year, in your opinion, is it worth reaching out to a hotel with a December contract to start negotiating lower number guarantees at this time?
I would,
I mean,
absolutely.
I did. I started early and I started with the floor plan. I said, tell me what the maximum is that you can accommodate, and then we went from there. So I started that discussion early, but I said, I started from the place of, I have every intention of trying to make this work. Give me a floor plan. And then I built the strategy around that.
And what I'd add to that, I agree with that. What I'd add is that I've told a number of clients, if you're going to try to negotiate down your minimums for sleeping rooms, food and beverage, and the corresponding attrition penalties, you want to do it sooner rather than later. You want to do it while the hotels, convention centers are more desperate for business, while they're not having a lot of stuff and they're looking forward to getting things on the books. They're going to be more willing to be flexible now, and we're seeing it left and right. 6 months from now, or 5 months from now, 4 months from now, as the country hopefully starts to turn the corner on the pandemic, they're not likely going to be as flexible. So yeah, I would absolutely do it sooner rather than later. I've told a number of associations that already.
Fantastic. Jeff and Christina, thank you both very much for your insight today. Very, very helpful. As a reminder to everyone, the webinar today was recorded. So within the next 24 hours, you should receive a brief evaluation that we do encourage you to complete, as well as a link to the recorded webinar. Thank you again for joining us, everyone, and please enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.